Hello people, and welcome to Crypto Exposed. Okay guys, gather around, let's have a conversation. So, there's a post that's been recently put out by Andrei Jikh. If you're not familiar with Andrei Jikh, he's basically a finance YouTuber. He covers crypto as well here and there, but he's mainly, more traditional finance. He was someone who, funnily enough, I actually remember when he was really new, I actually saw his channel blow up, and I'll be honest with you, I actually find his content really informative. He's like very good. He actually does magic on the side as well, so he was incorporating like magic as he's doing his videos, and it was very well produced, so I can understand why he's got the following that he has. But when it comes to crypto, I have to be honest with you, you can kind of tell he's not as well versed when it comes to crypto as what he is with just normal like traditional finance. And that's become more and more apparent to me as I see him like talk about XRP specifically. I'll tell you a quick story, won't take too long because I think the video might end up being a bit of a long one anyway as it is. I remember there was a time when he dropped a video about XRP, the very first video that he did, and I've got it right here, and it says right now, it says my thoughts on XRP and Ripple and XRP, sorry. I remember when I first saw this, it wasn't titled this. The very first title of this was actually Avoid This Crypto, and he was talking about XRP. And if you watch it at the end, you can see why. Like he gives pretty much like a reason as to why he doesn't really think XRP is a crypto that you should be holding. And as you can see, this video was 4 years ago. And I very much remember that, like, when I was in crypto at this time, I was still quite new. And I remember seeing this video, and because I thought, Andrei Jikh was someone who was like quite knowledgeable, I got a bit scared because I was invested in XRP. Now, thankfully, Lambo was someone who actually covered the video and in great detail and just covered everything about it and just debunked the whole video. And I was like, oh, okay, now I understand it more. And obviously now I've come to do my own research on XRP. So I've been in a position where I can actually, do these types of videos myself. And so he did a video on XRP not so long ago. And I basically did what Lambo did because I wanted to be in a position to help my audience the same way Lambo helped me when I was new, right? So I covered off the video that he covered about XRP. And I told you guys the things that were like realistic questions, the things that were uninformed, the things that he got wrong and whatever. And I was able to basically critique the video. And so we've got a new post here by Andrei Jikh that he's put up on X. And this is just another thing that I want to go through. David Schwartz actually did respond to this, and also Matt Hamilton. If you're not aware of Matt Hamilton, great mind in the crypto space. He was actually an engineer for Ripple at one point, but he left. I'm not going to go into the details as to why he left. It is public knowledge, but that's his own personal business. I'm not going to get into that, but great guy, to be honest with you. He's very blunt, but I think the thing is like, I completely understand this because there are a lot of people who have like negative biases towards XRP and sometimes the unrealistic hype biases as well, right? And so he's someone who's just trying to give you the truth. And I think after the years he's had, being whipped on both sides, because that's exactly how it is on my end. You debunk the high-end stuff, the unrealistic stuff, they don't like you. You try and say some of these things are maybe like a bit negative, they don't like that because you're speaking negative on XRP. Like, even if you're saying, yes, XRP can do this, you've got the people who are haters and they don't like it, so they go against you. But if you're saying, well, no, this is a little bit too unrealistic here, what you're saying, and you've got the fantasy land people who, think XRP is going to ridiculous numbers. And, either way, it just ends up being a difficult conversation and you just get slack on both ends, right? You're caught in the middle. So anyway, I've got this post here by Andrei Jikh. I'm not going to get into whatever David Schwartz has said. I'm not going to get into what Matt Hamilton has said. I'm actually just going to give you my own thoughts on this because, as I say, I'm someone who's, done my own research now. So I'm actually able to give my own answers to these questions. And, I'll say this before I get into it. I want to make this clear. I've never been someone who tries to portray myself to be like a genius, an XRP expert or anything like that. I'm not a guru or anything. In all honesty, I don't really believe any of these guys are gurus. They're all just people who have a certain level of research. I think we're all in the same boat realistically, and we're all just sharing our thoughts and opinions. That's the way I see it, and I'm just someone who's honest about it. I'm not trying to portray myself to be something that I'm not. So there might be things in here that you hear that you might disagree with, but these are my thoughts, and I'll tell you exactly why I disagree with some of the things that Andrei Jikh says here. So Okay, let's really get into this then. So I'm going to read out the post by Andrei Jikh, and then I'm going to go through piece by piece the things that I think are fair, valid questions, and the things that I think he's very uninformed about. So he says, I know people are very opinionated about this, but I've been following XRP since 2014, and I've still not found the answers to these questions. Genuinely looking for responses. Ripple has 300 plus bank partnerships, but after 13 years, shouldn't there be billions in daily on-chain volume? If XRP is volatile, why use it over stablecoins for transfers? If volatility is not an issue because it's a bridge currency, what is the incentive to hold it? Are bridge currencies still necessary when stablecoins will cover most pairs in the future? Why would giants like BlackRock use XRPL for tokenization instead of building their own blockchain? In brackets, Robinhood uses Arbitrum and plans their own. Geopolitical risk. Why would foreign countries trust a US-based private company payment network? Okay, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go through these bit by bit, okay? And I'm going to cover off each thing and show you exactly why Andrei Jikh needs to really do a bit more research when it comes to XRP. Okay, so Ripple has 300 plus bank partnerships, but after 13 years, shouldn't there be billions in daily on-chain volume? Okay, so the first thing about that is two things, right? Clearly, when Andrei Jikh is saying this, he doesn't really understand what the partnerships can actually represent, okay? So when they talk about partnerships, this could just be, for example, for RippleNet, right? So what is RippleNet? RippleNet is a software that Ripple provide, okay? And it's basically like Ripple's own version of Swift. It's basically like the messaging platform. Now, just because you're using RippleNet doesn't necessarily mean that you're using XRP, right? So, for example, you could use RippleNet to just transfer dollars or, another cryptocurrency, for example, or stable coins, etc. Like, it's just a messaging software. So, while these partnerships could be here with Ripple, we don't know how much of them are actually using XRP or the XRP ledger. We don't actually know that, right? So it could be that, yes, Ripple have these partnerships, but they could just be using the RippleNet software. And that could mean that they're not necessarily using XRP, or they're not necessarily using XRP to that degree, right? So that's the first thing that you've got to understand. Like, just because they've got these partnerships, Ripple have these partnerships, doesn't mean that they're necessarily using XRP. And I think this is again where I get with the hype stuff, where I have to debunk this stuff. People say like, oh, Ripple have got all these partnerships. Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're using XRP though. They could just be using the RippleNet software, right? So this is what people have to understand. It doesn't equate that just because Ripple have got these partnerships that automatically means that they're using XRP, right? The other thing I'll say is regulations, right? So when you think about it with banks, and all these other institutions, one of the things that we're really waiting for right now with crypto to get the financial institutions involved, etc., is regulations, because we've seen what happened to Ripple already from the SEC. The whole effect that they had from the sales, selling them as what the SEC claimed to be securities, etc. Banks are not going to want to touch this stuff properly until there's regulations. So even if they do want to use XRP, or they'll come to use XRP over time, it's not a thing where they're going to do it straight away with no regulations. Why? Because they're worried of legal scrutiny, right? Like the SEC could come for the banks and then they start getting these huge fines and stuff like that. They're not going to do that, right? There's a clear example of what happened with Ripple in the first place as to why they wouldn't want to touch XRP straight away. It's a known thing that, Ripple had a partnership with MoneyGram, and when the SEC lawsuit came in, that they dissolved that partnership. That they had that partnership dissolved because of the SEC lawsuit. David Schwartz also mentioned that there was a partnership in the pipeline, literally about to go through, and then once the SEC lawsuit came through, they decided to push back on that and said, we'll kind of wait and see how things go. So we can see the impact that that's had on XRP's adoption. So yes, the daily on-chain volume probably isn't going to be like spiking the way you think it's going to be, because again, you've got this very misguided idea of what's actually happening with the XRP ledger, and I don't think you understand that until we've got these clear regulations, that there's just not going to be that type of adoption anyway, right? That's just not going to happen. So Moving on to the next topic. If XRP is volatile, why use it over stablecoins for transfers? Okay, so this is something that I do understand. I think that's a valid question. But at the same time, if you understand how XRP works, so XRP can settle a transfer, and there's a difference between doing the transfer and settling the transfer, right? So this is what I mean about like Swift. So Swift can do a transfer and you can see it done on the page straight away, but it doesn't settle the transfer. So the settling actually happens on the back end, and that can take, 3 or 4 days to do, right? XRP can actually settle a transfer in 3 to 5 seconds. So what that means is if you are transferring, let's just say dollars to Great British pounds, for example, it will transfer the money from that one currency to the other currency in 3 to 5 seconds. There's no 3 to 5 days behind the scenes. It actually settles the whole payment. So the payment will leave that country, go to the other country, transfer into the other currency, all within 3 to 5 seconds, right? So think about it like this. If you've got something that's going on in 3 to 5 seconds, how much volatility do you really think can happen within 3 to 5 seconds? Right? Now, I understand that there could be a crash going on at the time, stuff like that, but within 3 to 5 seconds, you're not really going to get that much of a price concern, not that much of a significant risk. And so realistically, while I do admit and acknowledge that there could be an impact, I don't think it's going to be as bad as what people think it's going to be because of how quick the actual transaction can process, right? And so then you've got the other thing just to think about. Okay, you're talking about stablecoins, right? Okay, cool. I understand the whole idea of stablecoins is pegged to a fiat currency. So, for example, the digital dollar is pegged to the dollar. So obviously that's not going to move up or down in value. So that might be more appealing. But then you've got to think about two other aspects in that regard then, right? So if you're thinking about having to do it in that way, one, you've got the trust aspect because you're going to be transferring from one person's stablecoin over to the other person. So they've got to then trust that that stablecoin will be basically won't go bust or anything like that. So there has to just be an element of trust there that that stablecoin is properly backed and there's not going to be any news that there could be any kind of problem. And then also you've got to understand that there's still the issue of, okay, I've now got this country's stablecoin, but I need to transfer it into, our stablecoin or our currency or whatever, right? So you've still got the hassle then of, okay, I've got this stablecoin and now I need to transfer the pair over to to our stablecoin or our currency. So then you have to kind of think about, okay, what's the better option here, right? You kind of have to have that weighing it up of, okay, do I really want the hassle of one having to trust that if I get this stablecoin, it's not gonna, just go down the toilet at some point? Like, because if you think about Tether, for example, right? I'm not gonna get too deep into this, but the whole thing about Tether is how reliable is Tether, because they've not been willing to prove their backing, right? So behind the scenes, there's a lot of talk that Tether is basically not properly backed. They've been unwilling to show or prove how they back their treasury and stuff like that. So it's not confirmed if the dollars that are printed by Tether, these stable coins are actually backed 1-to-1 with the dollar, right? So it's very possible that Tether could fall down one day. It could be that they get exposed and, it comes out that they're not really properly backed. So you think about it from that perspective. If you're getting sent, Tether USDT, how comfortable are you going to feel with that? Do you see what I mean? So you then got to think about, okay, do I want to take that risk? And then also, do I want the hassle of having to then also convert that, that stable coin into your own stable coin or your fiat currency, your native fiat currency? Do you really want to have to do that? Or would you rather think, for the sake of, using XRP where there could be a little bit of volatility, which will be minimal as it's 3 to 5 seconds, I'm willing to take that over the alternative of having to do all the conversion myself, having to have that trust element of someone else's stablecoin. I'd rather just use XRP and in 3 to 5 seconds it's done. And I'll have my own currency at the end of it without me having to do any kind of work, right? So that's why it is possible that people could use XRP over stablecoins. Now, I will say this, it will become a preference thing. There might be some companies or banks who say, no, we would rather use stablecoins. And I think this is where with Andrei Jikh, I think part of his issue is I think he's looking at this very much of like the all or nothing type of mentality. I think he's looking at it from the perspective of every bank in the world will either use it or they just won't use it. It doesn't have to be, an all or nothing game here. It could be that you have some banks and some companies who are happy to use XRP, and it could be that you have some who are not. And this is why when we talk about like the $10,000 theories, I push back on this stuff, because I'm trying to say to you guys, it's not a guarantee that every bank in the world will use XRP. There will be some who may use, for example, other networks like Hedera can do cross-border transfers with stable coins. So they might think, hey, we're happy to just use stable coins, so we'll just use the Hedera network because maybe they prefer that network, or maybe they already had, dealings with that network for other use cases or whatever. So there's reasons as to why it doesn't necessarily mean that XRP is going to get every bank utilizing it, right? Like, it could be that they get a percentage, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But this is why I say people making up these theories of every bank ready to use it and stuff is, it's unrealistic. Okay, so then we'll get on to the next topic. If volatility is not an issue because it's a bridge currency, what is the incentive to hold it? Okay, a bit of a weird question here, to be honest with you, because okay, what he's basically saying here is, again, we're going back to like this whole idea of when people talk about XRP going to like a fixed amount, like for example, $10,000, right? This is why people say, oh, they're gonna, just fix the price at $10,000 to make it stable, right? Okay, yeah, I agree. If you was going to set the price at $10,000, there's no real incentive to hold it, in the sense of, okay, what's the point in holding this as an investment if it's going to be fixed at a set price? But that's just not going to happen. That's just a silly thought process. That's just not going to happen anyway. Well, not in my opinion anyway. But this is the thing. When you talk about an incentive to hold it, it could just because it's a valuable asset, right? Like, this is the thing again. Like, you got to look at XRP beyond just, ODL/Ripple payments. Everybody keeps looking at this from the perspective of like ODL/Ripple payments is like the savior of XRP, and that alone is what's going to just drive all of its value. It's not. That's why they're doing things like the AMM. That's why they're doing things like tokenization, right? That's why they've done things like the stablecoin. That's why they're buying like companies like Hidden Road. This is why they're doing other things, because they're not just focusing on one use case, right? They're looking at multiple things as to what can benefit XRP and the XRP ledger. So, like, it's not about just thinking of it from just a bridge currency perspective. It's about thinking about all the things that it can be utilized for, right? And thinking, okay, this is an asset that we think can be valuable over time, and so we do believe it will go up in value. And again, a weird reason why he asked this question is, like he said, if volatility is not an issue because it's a bridge currency, well, volatility is an issue because we can see it happening right now. Like you've already mentioned that Ripple has 300 plus band partnerships. So let's just say they're not all using XRP, but let's just say some of them are. Even if let's just say out of those 300 partnerships, let's just say 50 to 100 were actually using XRP. Well, there's still volatility there for those 50 to 100 banks. So, like, you kind of know that that's still a problem, right? So, again, I'm not really exactly sure why he asked that question there, if I'll be honest with you. Okay. Moving on to the next one. Are bridge currencies still necessary when stablecoins will cover most pairs in the future? Okay, so let's get into that then. Right. Okay. So if we think about these trading pairs in terms of stablecoins, I do agree. I do think over time, every country will have their own stablecoin because it's just going to be like the digital version of their native currency, right? So I do agree that will happen. And I've also had a friend who kind of just gave me some information before I got into doing this video. Like, he's quite a knowledgeable guy as well. And he was just mentioning how, like, in traditional finance, USD is basically kind of like the bridge currency because it's the world reserve currency, right? And so a lot of this stuff is still done from dollars. And also we mentioned that Hedera do like a service where they can batch bundle transactions where it can swap from one currency to another via like stablecoins. So this is something that's already going on Hedera in that way, but they're utilizing stablecoins. Okay, so this is what I will say. Are bridge currencies still necessary when stablecoins will cover most pairs in the future? Okay, the thing is, first and foremost, if you're going to do that in terms of stablecoins, right, you got to think of all the trading pairs that you would need, right? You got to think of every single country's stablecoin that would be needed to do that, right? Then you've also got to think of every country that would have to be necessary liquidity to be able to do these transfers. So this is where XRP would be the favorable option. Okay. And the other thing is like with stablecoins, if you're thinking about using them alone, right, you're probably thinking that really there's going to be one dominant stablecoin. And I don't see that. I don't see there being like one dominant stablecoin at all. Now, the other thing I'll say here is this in regards to the whole bridge currency thing. Okay. To stick to stablecoins, you would basically need like all trading pairs possible for all the country's stablecoins, right? Like for every single trading stablecoin in the world, you'd have to be thinking like all these exchanges would have to, like every single exchange you use would have to have every single trading pair available for every single country, for every single stablecoin. So when you start thinking about it into that level, it's quite complex, right? Whereas with XRP, you just utilize XRP and XRP will do the transfer for you. You also need the real deep liquidity to be able to do this. And you've got to think that there's some countries that, that are not, like third world countries and things like that. They're probably not going to have as deep liquidity. So these are the like problems that you could face when you think about it from that perspective. This is where using XRP as the bridge currency would be a lot easier, right? So yeah, in that regard, I think like, again, there are going to be people who may just still want to use stablecoins. I do think that is a possibility, but I do also think there are going to be people who would rather use a bridge currency. And this is why I say with XRP, like, I don't just look at ODL/Ripple payments being their only thing that could make them successful. I think there could be other things that make them successful too. That's why I don't look at it as like every bank will use them. I do think it's very likely that not every bank will use them. I think it's possible that there'll be banks that don't even use XRP at all. That could be using other networks. So, this is where I have to say, like, you're looking at this from a very all or nothing kind of perspective here. Yeah. Okay. Why would giants like BlackRock use XRPL for tokenization instead of building their own blockchain? Okay. Let's get into that then. So, okay. The thing with this is, I get what he's saying, but at the same time, it depends what their plans are, right? Because let's just say, for example, BlackRock create their own blockchain, right? The problem with that is, if they intend for that blockchain to be decentralized, which is really like, the way we're going now, obviously this is the whole enticement about crypto is that it's decentralized. Why does it matter whether they use the XRP ledger or their own chain anyway? Right? Because if it's decentralized, once they've created it, they no longer have like control over it. So it's like if they're going to just create their own decentralized network, well, why not just use a network that's already available and it's already got all the liquidity and, it's already tested and proven. So I'm not saying that guarantees that they will use XRP. I'm not saying that at all, but I do think that's a valid argument as to why they would use the XRP ledger instead. Like, for example, I believe BlackRock had done a certain level of tokenization already on the Ethereum network. And I believe it's not on their own network that they've built. It's just through the Ethereum network on that platform. So it's like they've already shown that they are willing to do that without creating their own, their own network. So, for me, I think they'll probably just stick with that. Now, is it possible that they would use their own? Yeah, possibly. Yeah, possibly. I'm not saying that's a guarantee that they will, but, at the end of the day, I don't think there's any issue as to whether they do or don't. Because if they create their own network, if they really want the control over it and whatnot, and they want it to be private, they're going to have to make it centralized, which a lot of people are not going to be so keen on anyway, because they're not going to be able to see anything and they're not going to have any kind of, control over it or anything like that. So unless they're willing to do their own centralized platform, then, why not just use a platform that's already out and accessible? That's just my thought process on that. Okay, let's get to the final question. Geopolitical risk. Why would foreign countries trust a US-based private company payment network? Okay, right. So again, this is where it shows to me that he doesn't really thoroughly understand the difference between Ripple and XRP and the XRP ledger, right? At the end of the day, in terms of Ripple payments / ODL that Ripple provide, yes, they are a US company, but they're just a US company that use a decentralized network, the XRP ledger. The XRP ledger is a decentralized network, right? Like this is the common misconception that a lot of people make, where they can't differentiate Ripple to XRP and the XRP ledger. Now, do Ripple hold the most amount of XRP? Yes, absolutely. But if you look at things like now, like how Michael Saylor is buying a load of amounts of Bitcoin, let's just say he continues buying ridiculous amounts of Bitcoin and eventually ends up having, I don't know, let's just say 10% of Bitcoin out there. Well, it's the same kind of thing, right? It's this guy who owns a certain percentage of a decentralized cryptocurrency. It doesn't mean that he now, has made Bitcoin centralized. He's just someone who owns a high percentage of it. That's all. And that's the same thing with Ripple. They just hold a high percentage of it, but they're just a company who hold a high percentage of it. Now, does this mean obviously they're going to be trying to help towards its future, towards its success? Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of, like, for example, the ledger, people haven't got to use Ripple payments or ODL. People can just use the ledger themselves, right? Like, so, look at it like this, right? If, let's just say, Russia wanted to use the XRP ledger, yeah, they can just use it. Like, they haven't got to go through Ripple to be able to do this. Now, don't get me wrong. If, let's just say, Russia wanted to use RippleNet, yeah, that's completely different, because Ripple will do KYC. They'll also have sanctions and stuff in place that they will follow. And so there will be a lot more, hurdles in that regard, possibly blocks. It might be that Ripple can't even do any business with Russia because of sanctions concerns, right? But in regards to just using the actual XRP ledger themselves, yes, they can do that. Right? Anybody can do that. It's just a decentralized network, so anybody can jump on it. Now, I will say this, it is possible that they could be thinking, well, we don't want to utilize XRP and get its value up so high, and then we're helping a US company's, net worth grow. That's a possible way that they could think about it, but the way that this is being phrased is completely different. It's completely inaccurate. Now, I'll say this, right? Now, I'm not here to say that I think XRP is going to replace like fiat currency or anything like that. I'll be honest with you, I don't think that's accurate at all. I don't think any crypto as it stands right now would replace fiat currency, in my opinion. I do think CBDCs could come in, but that's different, because that's not, for example, like Bitcoin overtaking a currency, or XRP or Ethereum, for example. That's, banks issuing out their own crypto stablecoin that they would be utilizing. But I don't think it would be a thing of I don't think it'll be a thing of like XRP is just going to start replacing fiat currency and then they'll use XRP instead. I just do not believe that's going to happen. However, I will say this. I do believe that the US dollar is slowly being debased, right? So, printing money all the time, just out of nowhere, like it's being debased, it really is. And I'm not saying that I think the US dollar will be completely destroyed, but do I think it's possible that they could lose the world reserve currency status? I think that's possible. You've got to understand, like, every so many years, the world reserve currency is supposed to change. So there was a point where the Great British Pound was actually the world reserve currency. And so what's actually happened is it's gone to America, and I don't know all like the ins and outs. I don't act like I thoroughly know this, but it's just never left America. So I don't know if it's a thing where they've just been like, we're not giving it up, or they got so powerful that it was, it was impossible to take it from them, but it's just never left America, when really it should have had, other countries having that status as well. And so that's obviously made a lot of countries reliant on America, because, the US dollar is the world reserve currency. But I will say this, you do have what's called the BRICS alliance now, which is BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I believe there's other countries that have joined along the way. But BRICS, those countries was the initial ones that came up and they formed BRICS. BRICS is basically countries who are forming together to have less reliance on the dollar, right? And so you can see that countries don't like being reliant on one country to have the world reserve currency. They're not going to want to use just like one dominant stablecoin over just having, for example, like a bridge currency. So I do apologize, I'm kind of jumping back and forth here. I'm going back to like the stablecoin argument, but let's just say there was one stablecoin that was the dominant stablecoin, right? For example, like you got to think, okay, so let's just go with RLUSD, and that's not me, trying to say it will be RLUSD, but let's just go with RLUSD. Let's say RLUSD became the dominant stablecoin, so everybody was trading through RLUSD now because the US dollar is still the world reserve currency. Well, like I say, you've got these BRICS nations and these countries who they're trying to come away from the dollar. They are trying to move away from being as reliant on the dollar as possible, right? Because all this does is empower America, right? That's all it does. And that's why, America are very keen to not lose the world reserve status currency, right? Like to lose the dollar as the world reserve currency. They don't want to lose that because it gives them a lot of power and it brings in a lot of money for them, right? So if you think about these countries now, if they were to just use, like RLUSD as the main stablecoin, why would they want to do that though? Like, if anything, they want to move away from that. And so I think they would rather use, XRP, where they can just use their own stablecoin and then just use XRP to automatically transfer it into, the dollar later on. That will be more beneficial for them than having to use their dollar, right? And having more dependence on the dollar. So I do think it's possible, and I'm not going to say this is going to happen, but I do think it's possible that a cryptocurrency could become a world reserve currency in the future. And part of the reason why I think that is because that takes away the certain country having so much power, right? Now, again, I don't think the US are going to want to give that up in a hurry. Of course not, because that's going to lose them a lot of power that they have. But, if over time, the dollar just keeps getting debased the way it is, and it goes the way it's going, I do think it's possible that they will lose that status, and it could be that they say, okay, let's just make it a level playing field where we make a cryptocurrency the world reserve currency. That way there's no one country that benefits more. Everybody's on a level playing field now, and we just use the cryptocurrency as the world reserve currency instead. That is a very real possibility. Now, I don't know how long that could take. I don't know, how soon that could come or if it will come. I'm just saying that these are possibilities that can occur, right? Okay, right. Finishing it up. So let's just get into his thoughts about XRP in general, right? So as I said, when he dropped this video, it was 4 years ago. If you think about XRP at that time, like I haven't bothered looking at a chart, but I know at that point XRP was under $1. I know that for a fact. It was under $1. It could have been about 50 cents, whatever, something like that, right? He said at that time, avoid this cryptocurrency, right? If you look at where XRP is now, look at how much money you could have made. And this is why, again, I say to people about being influencers, you've got to be careful with what you say, because there's people who could have watched Andrei's video, took it at face value, and not bothered getting into XRP. And also just believing the things that he was saying. Because as I said, when I first got into XRP, I wasn't fully researched at the time. And so it wasn't until I started to do my own research and learn more about it that I can do these types of videos. And so Andrei has an emotional bias here, if you ask me. Like, I think he's very much a Bitcoin maxi, to be honest with you. He's not going to say that out loud, but I think he's a Bitcoin maxi. And I think what happens with him with XRP is he doesn't like XRP, right? He doesn't. He makes content on it now because, one, it gets him a lot of views. And I think he's trying to remove the bias, but you can still see when he's asking some of these questions, like, I think there's still a bias there that holds him against really just understanding the real, concept behind it. But I'll put it to you like this, right? First and foremost, if you'd have listened to Andrei Jikh, back in 4 years ago when he first made his first video on XRP, you'd have lost out on a lot of money, right? Like, because I was in XRP at that time now, and I look 4 years on, you can see the difference of where XRP is in price. So that alone shows you that really Andrei has to be careful, and he clearly doesn't know when it comes to XRP. He doesn't understand its potential, right? Then let's just look at like what's happened in the last 6 to 7 months, right? We've got companies, banks, governments, etc. looking to adopt XRP, adding it to their treasuries, etc. So this alone tells you that people deem XRP a good and valuable asset, right? So this is the thing of him saying avoid a crypto. This is what I said to you before, like, I will never tell you like avoid a crypto or sell a crypto. It's up to you guys what you want to do. And even if I don't like a crypto or a network, that's not to say that it's not going to make money, right? Like, personally, as a user, I don't like Ethereum, but that's not to say that you can't make money holding Ethereum. I'd never say don't buy Ethereum. No, like, there's still opportunity there. I don't think there's as much opportunity as other networks like XRP. I still think they've got a lot more room to grow. But I'm not going to say don't get Ethereum. Like, that's up to you guys. I'm not going to tell you what to do. And I think this is where, he has to think about things from a bigger perspective and just of his own personal gripe against XRP, right? Like, even when I go through all this, what I've covered, like, it still shows me that he still really doesn't understand XRP. He doesn't. He's still got a lot of like learning to do. And as I said before, the main thing I'll say about this is you've got to go get past like the all or nothing mentality. Like, it can be a thing where, not all banks in the world use XRP. It could be a thing where not every company uses XRP, but there could still be enough for it to be a success. There could still be enough ODL/Ripple payments, partnerships that, it's still deemed a success. There could be enough tokenization. There could be enough through the AMM. Other use cases, right? All these other things just helping to fuel it to be a growing and thriving ecosystem. So if you're just looking at this one aspect, first and foremost, just cross-border payments, like, straight away, you're not thinking big enough, because you're only looking at one aspect of XRP. And, I tell people this a lot, like, there's a lot more to XRP than just cross-border payments, so even just looking at it from that perspective is a bit narrow-minded, So yeah, I'll leave it there because this has probably been a very long video. I haven't even checked what time we're on, but in all honesty, like, I think Andrei does really need to do some real research, because there's a lot of this stuff, like, you can kind of, doing a bit of research, you can understand this. He says he's been following XRP since 2014. If he's been following XRP since 2014 and he's still asking some of these questions, I'm a bit surprised, right? Because it's like, if you've been following since 2014 and still don't understand some of this stuff, that's a little bit crazy. That's a little bit crazy that you're still kind of so off guard with some of this stuff. Not to say that he didn't have some valid questions here, but some of the stuff I'm like, I'd expect you to know this by now, realistically, if you've been following it the way you say you've been following it and if you've done enough research. But yeah, at the end of the day, overall, I just look at it as this. Do I think XRP, even looking at the current price now around like $3, do I still think that XRP can go further up in value? Yes. And that's all I need to know. If I believe that with everything I know about XRP that it can go further up in value, then why would I avoid the crypto? Like, I still believe there's got a lot more value to get out of it. So there's a lot more potential to make more money. That's a simple enough answer, right? Like, even when he's saying all this, it's like, can you not see the value that you've missed out on had you have actually invested in XRP? And it's funny because in the video he talked about, in a video recently, he talked about how like he invested a lot of money in a token that he thought was going to make him a lot of wealth, and it didn't. It basically ended up crashing and he lost a lot of money. Don't know what it was because he didn't say, but that's what I'm saying. Like, it's funny how he can get that wrong and then not be open-minded to XRP and say, well, actually, maybe I've got this wrong and maybe there is a lot more upside potential to XRP. Maybe there's more stuff that I need to understand. And he has said, thoughtful questions here. So it's not like he's not taking it on, but I've seen him ask questions like this over time. And it just seems like even when Moon Lambo covered it, he actually responded back to Moon Lambo's video, and Moon Lambo covered off everything that he'd asked. And some of the things that he's asked in here are still things from what Moon Lambo had previously covered and stuff that he'd already asked. So that's what I mean. It's almost like he just doesn't want to accept the answers. It's like he just doesn't like the answers. So he's asking the same questions again, But anyway, I'll leave it at that. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Overall, I've covered my thoughts, so you can make of this what you want. As I say, I'm not no expert or anything like that, but this is just someone who's done some research on XRP and understands it on a bit of a deeper level. So I feel like I'm able to give my thoughts on this. Thank you very much for watching this. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And hit that bell. Take care.